Pastor Andy already mentioned that this is Transfiguration Sunday, and you may have heard that for many years, but what is it exactly? Transfigured is translated as a metamorphosis. It's a change on the outside that comes from the inside. Meta means change, and morphos means form. Example of this are a caterpillar to a chrysalis to a butterfly, or a daffodil, a bulb to a daffodil. And Jesus totally changed from human to divine. On the mountaintop, the disciples did not see a reflection. Jesus is radiated from within. He was changed into a more divine figure, one no longer of this world. At that time, the white clothing symbolized purity and divine status. We don't really know why Jesus singled out Peter, James, and John for this special revelation of his glory and purity. Perhaps they were the ones most ready to understand and accept the truth. Or perhaps because of the growing disbelief surrounding him as Jesus moves toward Jerusalem, that Jesus takes them with him to a high mountain. These 3 disciples were the inner circle of the 12. They're the ones always listed first in the group of disciples. They were among the first to hear Jesus call, and they were present at certain healings where others were excluded. These 3 were among Jesus' most trusted friends. You might be wondering, well, why was Jesus transfigured? Perhaps the disciples were still upset and confused because Jesus had predicted his death just a few days before. When he was transfigured, the disciples received a reassuring glimpse of Jesus' heavenly splendor, and God's spoken words powerfully reinforced Jesus' identity as the Messiah. What the disciples saw and heard must have made an indelible impression on their minds, preparing them to proclaim unique eyewitness testimony about the Lord. When they accompanied Jesus to the mount and witnessed the Transfiguration, Peter, James, and John had a preview of the glory of Christ. This further revelation of Jesus as Christ followed the conversation about Jesus' identity from the preceding chapter in Mark. And the voice of God affirmed that Jesus was indeed his beloved Son. Heaven's schedule to bring salvation to the world was on the countdown. This would fulfill the promise of redemption. And although the disciples were confused after the resurrection, they recognized this as a powerful affirmation of Jesus as the Christ, bringing atonement through his death. You know, a mountain is often associated with closeness to God and readiness to receive his words. The Transfiguration revealed Christ's divine nature. And God's voice exalted Jesus above Moses and Elijah as the long-awaited Messiah with full divine authority. Moses represented the law and Elijah the prophets, and this appearance showed Jesus as the fulfillment of both the Old Testament law and the prophetic promises. Jesus told Peter, James, and John not to speak about what they had seen because they would not fully understand it until Jesus had risen from the dead. Then they would realize that only through dying could Jesus show his power over death and his authority to be King of all. The disciples could not be powerful witnesses for God until they grasped this truth. This event gave them the courage to later share the gospel and to be the people that God wanted them to be. This event prompted Jesus to climb a mountain to another mountaintop, the cross of Calvary. The Mount of the Transfiguration and the Mount of Calvary are both expressions of the glory of Jesus. It was natural for the disciples to be confused about Jesus' death and resurrection because they could not see into the future. But we, on the other hand, have God's revealed word, the Bible, to give us the full meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection. We have no excuse for our unbelief. In Jewish thought, the presence of God was regularly connected with the cloud. It was in the cloud that Moses met God. It was in the cloud that God came to the tabernacle. It was the cloud which filled the temple when it was dedicated after Solomon had built it. And it was the dream of the Jews that when the Messiah came, the cloud of God's presence would return to the temple. The descent of the cloud is a way of saying that the Messiah had come, and any Jew would have understood that. A cloud was also frequently a symbol of God's presence to protect and guide. In the Bible Through the Seasons, Nicholas J. Connolly wrote, "If you were to take the Gospel of Mark and fold it in half like a roof, this would be the top. The transfiguration of the Lord is the centerpiece for this gospel. The first part is the going up to the top, miracles, teachings, and the expansive movement of Jesus. The downside of the roof sees the prediction of the passion and the death of Jesus and the outcome of the opposition that Jesus to the Jewish authorities. The Transfiguration has double significance. It did something very precious for Jesus. Jesus had to make his own decisions. He had to take the decision to go to Jerusalem, and that decision to face the cross. Obviously, he had to be absolutely sure that was right before he could go on. God spoke with him. Jesus went to God and said, "What will you have me to do?" And second, it did something very precious for the disciples. Jesus had said he was going to die. Things were happening which not only baffled their minds, but were also breaking their hearts. They had heard God's voice acknowledge Jesus as his son, and they had witnessed the glory of Christ. A witness has been defined as someone who first sees and then shows. So this time on the mountain had shown the glory of Christ, and now they had the story of his glory to hide in their hearts and to tell others. Not at this moment, but when the time came. I'd like to share what Dan R. Dick wrote about the passage and how it relates to us and what we are called to do. Mountaintop experiences are important experiences in the Christian experience, but they are worthless unless they motivate us to greater confidence and assurance when sharing the good news in the world. Every time we see validation that our faith is meaningful and based on more than hope and whim, it should compel us to share it with those who yet have to experience what we have. It's never enough that our faith remains a personal and private affair. As Peter, James, and John heard the very voice of God say, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." So we are reminded that Jesus provides all we need to be agents of love, grace, peace, healing, and forgiveness in our world. What happens on the mountaintop is important, but it is never more important than what happens in the world once we come back down. This is the equal significance that the Transfiguration has for us. After Jesus' resurrection, the disciples were to tell everyone what they had experienced, for Jesus' finished work would have demonstrated his true and full character as the Messiah. It was then that the Transfiguration event gave the disciples the courage to share the gospel and to be the people that God wanted them to be. In their own leadership challenges, Moses killed a man in a moment of passionate defense, and Elijah ordered those he perceived as enemies of God be slaughtered. On that mountain, God declares that in Jesus things will be different, and that those who follow him and follow the ways of God will also have to be different. God makes this abundantly clear in one simple, broken statement. This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him. That's the task before us. Have you ever experienced a mountaintop experience or heard the voice of God? How do you listen to Jesus? God does not appear to us in such a dramatic and visible way. He speaks more gently through our hearts, our memories, and through the shadowy moments of life. The transformative power of God's presence does not just surround us, it abides within us. As he was facing crucifixion, Jesus was asking if he was doing God's will. Instead of solving our own problems or finding answers from another human, it is much better to ask God what he would like us to do. Jesus asked God, "What would you have me to do?" Have you ever asked God, "What would you have me to do?" I want you to think about a mountaintop experience you may have had, or a time when you really felt the presence of God. You knew he was right there with you. Maybe you felt that when you looked at creation, or had a healing, or you were spared from an accident, or perhaps when you saw your child being born, or in the silence of music, preaching, communion. Those experiences are special, amazing, important, and wonderful. But you can't live on the mountaintop. Vacations are wonderful, but you have to go back home. And so on. Jesus went from the mountaintop to the cross, from dazzling white to dripping blood. Peter, James, and John went down from the mountaintop back to the problems of life. I had a mountaintop experience when I felt God calling me into pastoral ministry. I was so excited. But then the feeling was challenged in the valley when my closest family members did not feel that it was biblical for a woman to be a pastor. It was very difficult for me not to have their support, but in my heart of hearts, I knew this is what God wanted me to do. It was more important to listen to God than to those around me and have their acceptance. At that same time was when my husband was diagnosed with brain cancer. And although it was a difficult time, I never doubted my call. I felt God was preparing me to do exactly what I've been doing for almost 17 years. My family has accepted my ministry, and we could not possibly get along any better than we do or love each other more. God challenges us. God's challenges can be among our greatest blessings. How wonderful it would be then and now to stay on the mountaintop and just bask in God's glory. That day is not yet. Discipleship means denying ourselves, taking up a cross, and following him. You can't do that selfishly by staying on the mountain of glory. There are needs to be met in the valley below. If you want to share in the glory of Christ on the mountaintop, then we must be willing to follow him into the sufferings of the valley below. We can, and we actually can, have more than one mountaintop experience. Maybe they leave us speechless, or maybe you might be concerned about sharing it with someone because they might not believe you. What faithfulness is possible in the midst of change or difficulty? How will the transfiguration lead to transformation in you in this coming week as we observe the coming of Lent? Pastor Andy and I are going to be sharing some very challenging sermons with you for the next 6 weeks. We all need to be willing to accept some challenges and to make some sacrifices in order to grow closer to God and to be his witnesses. We cannot keep the glory to ourselves, and we cannot stop growing closer in our walk with God. Adore your Lord. Enjoy the mountaintop experiences, but don't be afraid to come down from the mountaintop. Our mountaintop experiences give us the courage and the strength to deal with the challenges we face in the valley experiences we go through. And if you need help going through some of those valley experiences, Pastor Andy and I are here for you. Or talk with a trusted friend. You don't have to go through those experiences alone. Never be afraid to ask for help. And prayer, of course, is also a tremendous help in both the joys and the sorrows of our lives. Treasure the benefits of being God's faithful follower. He will be with you on the downside and then on the upside of the resurrection. We are both strengthened and challenged by the call to follow as a disciple of Christ, even into the valley. Mountaintop experiences are wonderful. Valley experiences usually are not. We like living on the plain, very comfortable in the ordinary times of our lives. But the mountaintop experiences help to strengthen us for the days which are challenging. Never forget that no matter what you are experiencing, God is always with you. Always. Take comfort and courage in knowing that the difficulties we face make us stronger and are more able to help others in their valley moments. Thanks be to God. Amen.